Greetings, YouTube Nation. Last summer, I traveled to Puerto Penasco, Sonora, Mexico during the summer of 2023. I highly recommend traveling there, by the way. I had plenty of pleasant experiences that I will never forget. Anyways, as I began to absorb the various experiences that the port city provided, my mind began to wonder if life in the old Southwest during Mexican rule was anything like what it is in contemporary Mexico, and if life prior to the Mexican-American War in the Southwest had any effect on contemporary American life in the Southwest region in 2024. My experiences in Puerto Penasco, plus the little knowledge I had about the pre-Mexican-American War history in the Southwest, led me to do a little research and create this video for y'all. The goal of this video is to shed light on the contributions that Mexicanos had on the culture and identity of the Southwest, as well as the identity of the entirety of the United States, as well as determine what were the differences and similarities between modern-day Mexico and its former territory in the north. I wanted to originally post this video during Hispanic Heritage Month in September, but I didn't want another creator to beat me to this subject, so in honor of Cinco de Mayo, I decided to post this video on, Cinco de Mayo. In the first part of this video, I would like to start off with some of the more obvious similarities. Like, for example, Spanish was the official language of the territory. First introduced with the permanent settlement of Santa Fe by the Spanish in modern-day New Mexico in 1610, the language has gradually spread throughout the Southwest throughout the following centuries, with the establishment of Catholic missions by Franciscan preachers. Spanish coexisted along with countless indigenous languages. When the Spanish weren't directly forcing their culture onto the indigenous populations. Today, if I were to ask you what is the fifth largest country in terms of people who speak Spanish as their primary language, would you have guessed the United States? The US is just behind Spain with 41 million speakers. The top 6 states with the highest rate of Spanish speakers used to be former Spanish possessions themselves, perhaps not too surprisingly, with Florida being the only state in that list not being in the Southwest. Spanish has not only left its mark as a spoken language, but as the identity of the region itself. Many cities, big and small, are Spanish named in origin. Within those cities, neighborhoods, schools, parks, and even streets can trace their origins back to the Spanish language. Technically speaking, Spanish has been spoken in the Southwest for far longer than English has. Spanish namesakes are not a recent invention of woke Democrat leftists. So, if anyone tells you Spanish has no place in the US, kindly remind them about its long presence in the Southwest. Roman Catholicism was the state religion of Mexico during its rule in the American Southwest. Unlike Mexico of today, church and state were not separated because the main Mexican reform, La Reforma, that concerned that subject wasn't passed until the 1850s and 1860s. Catholicism was first introduced to the Southwest when the Spanish first arrived in the 1500s. A permanent Catholic presence was established with the creation of missions. For example, San Xavier Mission in Tucson was first established in Tucson by Father Eusebio Kino in 1692, with the current modern building being constructed in 1793. The Spanish inhabitants quickly went to work converting the nearby indigenous populations to Catholicism. And to this day, the American Southwest has a higher concentration of Catholics present compared to the rest of the country, especially the Southeast and Midwest. Now I will cover some differences between the Mexican North and the modern-day Southwest, with some misconceptions regarding the territory. Although behind the US in the development of transportation infrastructure, Mexico is far more connected through transportation today than it was prior to 1846. The territory was considered barren, unruly frontier land by Spanish colonists and Mexican settlers. Any settlements founded by Spain or Mexico were often isolated and difficult to supply and maintain year-round, forcing any people living in them to become hardy, self-sufficient folk. Once the U.S. gained control of the territory, the U.S. began investing in railroad infrastructure, including the Transcontinental Railroad and the railroad that would be the main excuse for the Gadsden Purchase in southern Arizona during the 1850s. As Americans began to fall in love with the horseless carriage, highways began to be constructed during the first half of the 20th century. The most famous original highway was Route 66, and the majority of Route 66 did run through the Southwest. However, it was a precursor to the Eisenhower administration's interstate highway system. The I-10 connects the entire southern U.S., and I-19 specifically connects Tucson to the country of Mexico. Finally, airports reduced travel time within the Southwest and to other regions significantly in the latter half of the 20th century. This transportation connectedness has united the Southwest, introducing it to other regions, allowing people and goods to flow in and out of the region with ease and lower costs. The territory was also far less populated. By 1848, the amount of Mexican citizens integrated into the U.S. numbered upwards of 100,000. As of 2023, across 7 states in the Southwest, the population is roughly 91.4 million inhabitants. Back in the early 19th century, many Mexicans regarded the Southwest as frontier land. This territory throughout Mexican rule was also populated by many indigenous tribes. However, there was no viable way for the Spanish, Mexican, or American governments to accurately determine the approximate population of indigenous folk. The region has always been racially and ethnically diverse. Before the Spanish arrived, it was obviously all Native Americans. As the decades wore on, more and more Spanish and Mestizo pioneers arrived and settled in the region. This continued to reign true when the Mexicans took over. When the U.S. seized the territory, different regions in the Southwest were settled by Anglo-Americans at different rates. While Texas and California were beginning to be settled and have their demographics changed as soon as the 1840s and 50s, Arizona and New Mexico had majority Mexican and indigenous populations well until the end of the 19th century. During the 20th century, all 4 Southwest states had majority Anglo populations. However, beginning in the 1980s, the Hispanic population began to gradually increase until sometime in the 2010s, when they began to become the largest ethnic groups in California and New Mexico. Arizona and Texas were also trending in that direction. To believe Hispanic majorities are a new phenomenon in the Southwest would be historically inaccurate. This trend may simply be a reconquista of the Southwest. It is up to you, each individual viewer, to decide whether that is a good thing or not. As long as the region is progressing and becoming more prosperous, I personally don't see a reason why whoever lives within the region should be any issue to anyone. The Southwest had way less resources than it does today, both financial and in terms of commodities. However, it is a misconception that the Mexican government and society completely neglected the territory. Matter of fact, American settlers, unacquainted with life in the desert, would later use skills learned from the previous Mexican residents in order to truly prosper in the region. For example, one industry where Americans picked up on skills acquired from Mexican workers is agriculture. Many skills were imported by the Spanish from the Old World to New Spain, and then used by the Mexicanos. The Spanish introduced their own cattle, thin and wiry animals with long horns capable of holding their own when it came to defense. Cattle ranches were operated in a much different manner compared to American dairy farms in the East. These dairy farms were often small, family-owned operations, as opposed to Western cattle ranching, which involved landowners owning large tracts of land simply because resources such as grazing, food for cattle, and water were scarce and spread across a large area of desert land. Mexicanos partook in more communal land use compared to their American counterparts. No, they were not socialists. It was just simply more practical to do it in the way they did. The aforementioned branding helped distinguish which cattle belonged to whom. One skill associated with cattle farming is branding, which was an old world method of distributing cattle ownership imported by the Spanish. Branding was first documented in the New World by Hernan Cortés with his signature Triple Cross in 1519. Also, the products derived from the cattle differed from farms in the East. The Eastern American farmers specialized in dairy products, while Southwest cattle ranchers specialized in meats, hides, and tallow. When you think of a main character in a classic Western, no one seems like a more appropriate character than the classic American cowboy. However, what if I told you that the cowboys that we think of today took many of their trademark traits from the Mexican vaqueros? For starters, the cowboys' outfits originated from the vaqueros. The traditional cowboy hat that many cowboys wear took its inspiration from the Mexican sombrero, leather chaps from Mexican chaparreras, the boots specifically designed to fit in the stirrups of saddles inspired by Mexican botas, not to mention the poncho. The Western saddle was also invented by Mexican vaqueros. What distinguished the Western saddle from European ones was its horn located on the front, allowing an easy spot to place rope. By the way, all the rope tricks with lassos were originally perfected by the vaqueros. Many words from the cowboy lexicon are also originally derived from Spanish, including bronco, stampede, corral, lasso, burro, buckaroo, vamoose, rancho, ranchero, mesa, canyon, mesquite, and chaparral. Another farm animal important to the Spanish and Mexican settlers were sheep, specifically the merinos and the churros. However, the churros, with their coarse wool, were perfect for the desert environment. The sheep herding industry blossomed in the territory of modern-day New Mexico. Once in the Southwest, Americans began to become accustomed to the industrial-level business of sheep herding. They began learning about the importance of the hierarchical system. The patrion was the shot caller, often overseeing several managers who would guide the vaqueros on how to properly tend to the sheep. The front line workers were known as the pastores, or herders. Each one of these pastores were responsible for upwards of 1,500 to 2,000 sheep. They constantly stayed with the animals through night and day, checking up on the herd's health and guiding them to fresh grazing land. During spring, which is the mating season, the pastores would assist with the birds and raise orphan sheep themselves. Once the Americans saw the success of the system, they spread sheep rearing throughout the Southwest. The American settlers crossbred the churros with the Mexican merino sheep to produce a sheep with more superior wool. With these changes and lessons learned from the Mexican rancheros, American wool production soared from 5 million to 22 million pounds a year. Now, moving on from animals to crops, the eastern half of the U.S. received year-round rain and typically didn't have to worry about a lack of precipitation. However, in the desert Southwest, rain was scarce and months would even go by without the necessary rain to sufficiently keep crops growing. Combining the irrigation skills of the local Pueblo Indian tribes and Spanish irrigation skills learned from North Africa, Mexican farmers adapted to the harsh environment. Using what little water there was available from local streams, farmers would construct simplistic dams that would help contain the water. Then the farmers redirected the water towards the crops through the use of irrigation ditches. Once the water reached the fields, the Mexicans made sure the fields were leveled evenly. They then divided the fields into squares. Once a square was adequately filled with water, they would create a hole into the side of the square and the water would gradually fill the next square. This process was repeated until the whole field was watered. Mexicans also introduced crops such as grapes, dates, olives, apples, walnuts, pears, plums, apricots, peaches, and quinces. Citrus fruits such as lemons, limes, and oranges were also introduced into the region by the Mexicanos. While Americans built upon Mexican farming standards and perfected them over the years, it was Mexican farmers and their skills who showed Americans it was possible to live and thrive in the seemingly desolate desert. Mexican skills in the mining industry were also important to helping Americans become successful in the mining industry. Americans first started migrating to California for gold. Many of you will know of these individuals as 49ers, simply because many of them migrated to California in 1849, hence the 49er nickname. Anyway, Americans knew little about mining back east and began picking up on the skills that Mexicanos knew for generations, such as using a botella, or gold pan, which is the bowl that you envision when thinking about gold miners sifting for gold in their riverbeds. Mexicanos also utilized riffle boxes, which basically were boxes with wood called riffles at the bottom. This helped trap heavy gold pieces while mud simply got washed through the bottom. Rastas were also utilized to crush large rocks in order to access valuable products such as gold or quartz. Rastas were grinding mills powered by horses. In 1859, Henry Comstock was looking for gold only to be disappointed that he found worthless blue stuff. However, when shown to a Mexican miner, he immediately recognized that it was silver. The Comstock lode was estimated to be worth over 300 million in silver and gold. Mexican miners also tipped Americans off on copper deposits in Arizona. Arizona's copper mines would help power America since copper was used in many electric components. Mexican mining skills are what helped America's mining industry be born and eventually prosper. Mexican laws also influenced new American laws being established in the West. For example, Americans used to claim any body of water within their property lines as their own. However, in the West, Americans had to accept a more communal approach to water rights, which led to Americans accepting local water policy that was in the best interests of the community. For those that are upset about the principle of splitting property evenly between husband and wife, you can blame the Mexicans. In America, women who were married had few property rights, with the husband having sole possession of property. However, when immigrating to the Southwest, couples were introduced to community property rights. In other words, property ownership being split evenly between husband and wife. Mexican citizens were also more used to the abolition of slavery, with the Mexican state banning slavery in 1829, decades before the U.S. We can't forget to mention Mexican contributions to the region's architecture. Wood was a sparse commodity in the desert Southwest, so adobe houses became a familiar sight in the Southwest. The material used was much more suited for the hot, arid environment. The building materials were also readily available in the surrounding countryside, a mix of grass, clay, and water. The internal temperature inside the structure was perfect for the hot summers and the surprisingly chilly winters. Mexican cuisine was also an influence on American gastronomy. Think of Tex-Mex as a prime example. Also, my hometown of Tucson is the only city in the U.S. recognized by the UN as an international city of gastronomy, simply because of the city's heritage of having a unique blend of indigenous Mexican and American cuisine. Community festivals and music are also a good example of Mexican influence in American culture. American country music, especially Western country music, can trace part of its heritage back to the corrido, or a dramatic ballad accompanied with guitar music. Rodeos were a common source of entertainment in the old desert Southwest. Mexicanos would get together and have various competitions such as calf roping, bull riding, and bronco busting. Once again, Tucson has a yearly rodeo festival commemorating these events. Mexican and American culture are far more intertwined than most people on both sides of the border realize. Although it may not seem so to many people, Mexico is more politically stable today compared to when it controlled the Southwest. At first, a monarchy was briefly established before being overthrown and replaced by a chaotic train of interim councils, presidents, and coup leaders. Even during the American invasion, there was infighting between the leader of the army, Santa Anna, and the political leaders of the government. With this fractured leadership, there was more effort by each member to pursue their own political agendas and passing legislation that would have made investments in the North. Once the U.S. incorporated the Southwest into its territory, military officials were briefly in charge until territorial governments were established. While California and Texas were admitted in 1849 and 1836, Arizona and New Mexico were admitted much later, both in 1912 respectively. They meant the people of the Southwest finally got a little more representation at the state and federal level with elected representatives in Washington. Many different minority groups have had to fight for representation since then, including tribal nations slowly gaining more rights and sovereignty from the federal government within their reservations. No matter which government has ruled over the Southwest, the various peoples that reside in the region have fought for rightful representation for generations. If you made it to the end, I hope this video educated you on the various contributions and influence that the Mexicanos had on the Southwest as a region and the entire US as a whole. If you indeed liked this video, please don't forget to like and subscribe. Thank you, and have a blessed day.